All right, back to the top. So tonight's talk will focus a lot on sleep and pain, but we will cover some other things as we go through. Um, Again, by all means, mic up or shoot us a chat if you have any questions, and we'll go through it. So before we start digging into it, we got to kind of talk a little bit about Katie Sangsikon. She's leading the charge as far as physical therapists. She's her focus as a PT is she's a doctorate and a physical therapist. Her focus is getting PTs to address sleep hygiene with patients. She is definitely the leader. She's written some good clinical perspectives, some of which we'll cover tonight, on how to address sleep hygiene with your patients. But Katie is awesome. So follow her on Twitter if you don't already. A lot of you guys are probably, I don't know, I don't use Twitter for anything other than things like following people like Katie. So for me, it's just an information source from like authors or things like that. But I'm not interested in anything else on Twitter. It's kind of, Alan always says it's dead. I think he's right. Like, I don't engage on Twitter, nothing like that. But it is good for following folks like Katie, where you can get some little snippets of information pretty quickly. So if you're on Twitter, give her a follow. It's at Katie Sleep PT. That's her handle. So this is where the conversation really starts. It starts with showing that sleep and back pain are intimately related. Most of the conversation will float around back pain. The reason being, always back pain is going to kind of lead the charge in the way of pain research because it's so common. 95% of folks are going to develop some form of back pain at some point in their life. We all sort of know that when someone's back is killing them, they're going to have a hard time sleeping, right? It's pretty obvious. It's not something that's really news to anybody. But this nice little article this is a nice big article in 2017 by Kovacs really kind of started piquing some interest here. The N was 461, which for those of you that don't read a lot of research, that's a decent N in physical therapy research or any kind of research, really. That's a good N. You can start really looking at some different things once you have that big of a number. But really, this article, if you read it and gloss over it, it kind of almost seems insignificant. But what you realize if you really read it and dig into it is that there's one consistent outcome in this article, and that's regardless of what happens, if someone's pain goes down, their sleep improves. If their sleep improves, their pain goes down. So it's not that one is causative. There's no way to tell from this article that like improving sleep reduced back pain. It did, but also reducing back pain improved sleep. So it wasn't like that you could point the finger to one or the other as being a causative relationship. We just know that those two things ride together. There's a definite association, and this article really strongly showed that. This was a really good starting point for us to start the conversation, showing that we know for sure there is a relationship here between the two. We'll dig into that more as we go. This article is even more interesting, especially if you work at all in a corporate health environment or something like this. This should be in your back pocket. You should have this thing memorized. You should be ready to talk with this for folks at the C-suite or wherever. I mean, it should be something that you can talk about really easily, because what this article did was it looked at a huge amount of people, right? Over 2,000 people, 2,200 folks, almost 2,300 folks. And what they did is they measured sleep quality and measured areas of pain before the trial started. And then all they did was just tracked the people for the 5 years following. So they measured neck pain, back pain, like people reported those things, either or both, or if they reported no neck pain or no back pain. And then they tracked those people for 5 years. What they were looking to see is if any of these folks missed a big chunk of work, which is very, very important for companies. Obviously, huge sums of money go down the drain when employees don't show up to work. To define a big chunk of work in this study, they said more than 14 consecutive days. So that is, I would say, a big chunk of work. For the most part, if you're missing 14 days, we kind of know that's where things are tipping to chronic, and where a lot of even further health implications kind of come into play. But without a doubt, a big deal, right? What they wanted to know, was there any correlation between sleep quality and pain locations? So meaning, neck or back pain. So you're looking at 3 graphs now. The top graph there is folks at the beginning, day one, before the 5-year follow-up, at the beginning, they reported no low back pain and no neck pain. The middle graph are folks that reported neck pain or back pain, but not both. So they had one or the other. And then the bottom graph was either low back, or they had low back and neck pain. So they had both going on at once. And you can see it's broken up by year. So you've got year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 on the x-axis. The y-axis is percentage of folks that missed 14 days consecutively. So as a percentage of the folks in the trial, this many missed that much. Now you're looking at a few things. So the darkest bar, the one that's on the far left under each year, that is folks that sleep well, okay? The lightest bar, the ones in the middle of the three, that were folks that slept sort of mediocre, right? And then the far right one, the one that's sort of grayish, it's not as dark as the one on the far left, those are folks that slept poorly. And you're going to notice a few things when you start to look at this. The first thing you'll notice is probably obvious to you already, is the folks that reported more pain at baseline. So before they started tracking, the folks that had back pain and neck pain, they missed significantly more works than the folks that didn't have a lot of pain on board. So that's not a big surprise. Obviously, pain's a big reason why people miss work. And this article really kind of furthered that. So what you're seeing there on that bottom, that third graph, is when folks have a lot of pain, they miss more work. But the other thing that's really probably the more interesting finding from this study is that the relationship between sleep is independent of pain. So if you look in any of these, what you're going to see is that basically the folks that sleep poorly versus the folks that sleep well, regardless of whether they had pain or not, they're about twice as likely. They're 100% more likely to miss a 14-day chunk of work if they don't sleep well. So sleep is an independent variable for predicting missed work. So with or without pain at baseline. So, you might lump these people in your head at the bottom as sort of those less healthy folks that you would expect to miss work. And it probably doesn't surprise you as much, but if you realize that across each of the three, the commonality there is that it's almost double as many folks across every year that end up missing a huge chunk of work that have poor sleep. So that was sort of the conclusion here. And it just goes to show you sleep is such a driver of function, right? It's not a small thing. Sleep disturbances are an independent driver of work absences. You don't have to have pain to have work absences. If you just have bad sleep, the odds of you getting sick are probably much higher. The odds of you having some sort of catastrophic health situation are much higher. Sleep is a huge deal. Very, very strong finding in 2015. So from the corporate side, that was one of the, really the first big, strong findings. Before we move forward, this next study is pretty cool, but I want to make sure everyone sort of understands that. And if you have any questions, fire away. Okay, cool. Let's move forward. This is where things start getting cool. This is where we start to look at why is this happening? Why do people who aren't sleeping well report so much more pain? Is it causative, or is it that people in pain have a hard time sleeping? What is it? What are the drivers? Hack really started to dig into that in 2012. So this was the first time they looked at this. This was a cool study. All right, so let's talk about the study. So what Hack looked at was he measured nervous system processing at baseline. So prior to any sort of intervention, how was their nervous system processing? And he did that a multitude of ways. Warmth detection threshold, pain sensitivity, and then, tests that are like pain modulatory mechanisms. The pain sensitivity ones are like heat pain threshold and pressure pain threshold. I think most of you guys are probably familiar with that, but I'll briefly describe. Pressure is the easy one, right? So they usually measure this on the backside of the forearm. They take an algometer. It measures how much force is going into the forearm. At some point, everyone's going to stop feeling pressure and eventually report that pressure as pain. And the algometer gives them a number that they can then correlate it with. So that's how you measure pain pressure threshold. Heat's very similar, but it's just an increasing amount of warmth, right? Now, the pain modulatory mechanisms are more interesting. Temporal summation was one of them. I think probably most of you guys are familiar with temporal summation, but again, this one's very common in your more chronic pain, your persistent pain patients. What it is like if you take the exact same stimulus and you apply it 10 times, in a normally processing nervous system, they should report the 10th exactly the same as the first. It's the same stimulus. What happens when there's maladaptive processing is they report an increase. They will report that stimulus as being more aggressive on the 10th time than they did the first. So it summates temporally. It actually ramps up their nervous system and they feel more with the same stimulus. So that's temporal summation. The really cool one of all these, and like I'm so glad they measure this one, is diffuse noxious inhibitory control. So diffuse noxious inhibitory control is a mouthful, but it is really, really interesting. All right, so let's talk about what's normal with that first, and then we'll talk about what happens in altered processing. So what's normal, the best way to think of this is what they'll do is your initial test will be that pain pressure threshold. So they'll measure it on the back of the forearm. Then what they'll do is they'll dunk someone's foot in uncomfortably warm water, right? So it's enough that it's a bit painful. And so they will, when they do that, there's a major rush of afferent nociceptive info that's going in those C fibers through the foot, right up to the spinal cord. That nociceptive signal kind of rushes this huge amount of information up to the brain. The brain then looks down and it says, hey, your foot's in a hot thing of water. Let's get it out. And so it generates a pain experience in order to motivate you to get your foot out of the water. Because your brain is trying to protect you. That's what pain is. It's a protective mechanism. And, you know, you got to tell your patients all the time, like, hey, pain is a good thing. It's a protective mechanism, right? That's why we experience pain. It keeps us from damaging our foot, right? When it's in this hot thing of water. In a healthy brain, the moment you get your foot out of that hot water, that brain is going to dump some neuronal signals into the cord. Those signals are going to activate inhibitory interneurons that make it far harder for that nociceptive primary afferent to then stimulate the secondary afferent and get that message up to the brain. So you get this kind of effect, right? The brain sort of calms everything down. The reason being is that your brain's like, okay, we've got this. There's no reason for me to continue feeling pain because the foot's out of the water. There's nothing else to worry about. We're good here, right? It knows you're good. So that's a really handy thing because if it didn't do that and you just continued feeling pain in your foot for the rest of your life, it'd be really inconvenient for anything you encounter from there on out, right? So you really are glad you have that ability to quit feeling pain because it lets you move on about your life, right? What happens with diffuse noxious inhibitory control is that you don't get that dump. And not necessarily that you still continue to feel pain in your foot, but what you will see is that if you then retest, so if you want to prove that this happens, that someone's is altered, what you do is you retest their pain pressure threshold after the painful stimulus of the foot in the water. And what you'll see is in a normal system, they should be able to tolerate significantly more pressure because now there's all this inhibition going on at the cord. Less noxious stimulus is going up because the brain is going, shh, like, I don't need to hear it. We're good. We're all set here. In a normal system, that happens. In a maladaptive system, what you're going to see is that it doesn't change. And either you get the same measure on pain pressure threshold or even sometimes less. They can tolerate less because maybe it's starting to sort of summate there. So what you're looking at with that is sort of the ability of your brain to quiet things down and to say, hey, we got this, we're good. And it does that globally. It doesn't just do it at the foot. So it hits every level of the cord. Therefore, every level of the cord that, you know, through your upper extremity, through your trunk, through your lower extremity is going to have those inhibitory effects. Pretty groovy thing, pretty awesome thing that we have developed that really helps us kind of stay, you know, viable. So those are the normally functioning things. Does everyone understand what each one of those things mean as far as nervous system processing? I know that's a bit of a mouthful and it can get kind of confusing at times, but I want to make sure you guys understand that before we talk about the outcomes. All right, the outcomes, right? So what Hack was looking at, he was looking at folks with insomnia versus those who did not, healthy controls. And what he found when he compared those two is that the tolerance was lower across the board, and the nervous system was processing was affected across the board in folks with insomnia. So people with insomnia had maladaptive processing across each one of those tests. So if you think about it, like the 10th stimulus they said was worse than the first. So they had that temporal summation. They didn't report a difference in pain pressure threshold testing after they had that foot in the water test that we just spent that time talking about. They didn't get those normal nervous system adaptations. So, if you think about it, their processing sort of broken. Folks with insomnia, it's almost kind of broken. And it's quantifiable. You can actually measure the fact that it's messed up. Well, that's all well and good, right? But when you're talking about insomnia, you're talking about like a diagnosed condition. And generally speaking, by the time it's diagnosed, it's been going on for a while, right? Like most people don't just go to the doctor after one night of poor sleep, and get diagnosed with insomnia. They've been struggling for a while. So that article had a little bit of criticism as far as nervous system processing because it was looking at folks with insomnia. So what Simpson looked at in 2017 was all healthy people. They said, well, what happens if you just deprive healthy people of sleep? What happens to their nervous system processing? So this was a cool study because it followed up on that last thing, but it wanted to look at folks that started off with normal processing rather than just folks that, kind of had no chance with the insomnia. So they took 17 folks and they split them right down the middle. Half of them got they continued about their 8 hours of sleep a night. So, that's pretty good, 8 hours. The other half, they limited to 4 hours, 5 nights a week. And then they said 2 nights a week, sleep 8 hours. So this kind of mimics what most people do and what Matthew Walker calls like social jet lag, where most people will work hard during the week and they might only sleep 4 hours a night. And then on the weekend, they crash hard and try to sleep 8 hours to catch up, which you'll be disappointed to find out doesn't work super well. It's hard to catch up on sleep. It's not something that's really able to be done. But as far as the study was concerned, this was cool because we now had 2 different groups and we controlled for the sleep so we could really find out what happens when you deprive people of sleep. So they tracked them over 3 weeks, but what they found was within the first week, the group that had less sleep, the 4-hour group, what they found was that their pain processing became maladaptive. So within the first week, it became maladaptive. Super interesting findings because these are normal, healthy folks that didn't have any diagnosis of insomnia. So we know sleep affects pain processing, or stimulus processing is probably the better way to say it. We know it has a huge effect on the nervous system processing, without a doubt, and it has it very acutely. It has it within a week. All right. So let's kind of talk a little bit about that. Let's sort of summarize it, and let's talk about like how this is what the type of conversation I would have with my patient about it. Is, like I would show them this picture and I would say, hey, listen, John, I want you to imagine laying in a hammock in the mountains, right? You're on vacation, all is well. You don't have any stresses. It's day 3 of the 7-day vacation. You're not worried about going back to work. There's no stressors. The kids are playing. You're having a couple beers. All is good, right? You've got nothing to worry about. When that is going on, when you're in that state of mind, you're in that recovery mode, your brain is going to send signals down to neurons that activate those inhibitory neurons, which, you can definitely find better ways to say that to John, your patient, but your brain's going to send signals down to your spinal cord that activate these inhibitory neurons on the cord, which are going to prevent those nociceptive messages from getting up the cord. The reason being is that your brain doesn't feel a threat. It doesn't want to hear about it, right? Your brain is checked out. It's on vacation. It's like, we're good, man. There's no threat here. Nothing to worry about, right? But what happens when you are under a threat, or when your brain is perceiving you under a threat? So imagine you're really stressed. You've got too much work to do with not enough time. Your personal relationships are a little stressed. You're not making it to the gym. You're not sleeping well. All your relationships are being strained. All of that's going on. The brain actually does the exact opposite, right? So it inhibits those inhibitory neurons, and the volume knob ramps up. And the brain says, I do want to hear about it. I need all the information I can get. We're stressed. I need to know what's going on so I can respond to this threat. The brain's really able to do these things to sort of protect your body, right? That volume knob increasing, that's why your heat pressure threshold goes up. That's why your pain pressure threshold goes down. I'm sorry. That's why your diffuse inhibitory noxious control disappears, right? The brain is very literally, from a neuronal level, amplifying all the nociception to keep you safe. There is no single greater way to get the brain to be more concerned than to voluntarily reduce the amount of sleep you're getting. Your brain will immediately be concerned. And the reason being is it processes that as, hey, this is an emergency. I need you to stay conscious, right? So the best way to get your nervous system ramped up, to get your volume knobs turned all the way up, is to just inhibit your sleep. So, that story there is really important. And I think it's a nice foot in the door at times for your pain science type conversations, because it's very physiological. Like it's really, this is maybe another way through that door that doesn't make people feel super accused of faking, because it's very it happens in the first week. So it's easy to have that conversation with people once you get that, memorized and understand what's going on in the body. Super important for you to be able to have that conversation. All right, let's keep going. So this is really the only article that we're going to talk about that examines all of the research to try to determine causality. So really what it was looking for was, when people have low back pain, they have a hard time sleeping. That is true, right? Or could it be when people have a hard time sleeping, their processing is altered and therefore their back pain goes up? I think traditionally we as PTs have sort of believed in that first part, right? Like, you have an uncomfortable back, like you're going to have a hard time sleeping. This is why you can look online and find about 1 trillion different pillows, right, that will magically help your back. You can find all sorts of things to sleep with that are going to help your back. It's because as a public, as a profession, we've really believed that when people have back pain, they just have a hard time sleeping. But this article really kind of digs in and looks at all the research across. It's one of those analyses. And what it shows is that, like, in more often than not, it seems to be that when sleep is cut off, the processing is changed, which leads to back pain. And obviously it can lead to chronic pain and disability. You have to have acute pain before you have chronic pain. So interestingly, this article, a bit old, 2013, but it's the best we've got. And what it shows is that it seems to be that sleep may be the more important factor rather than back pain. That being said, most of you guys, if you've followed ICE for any amount of time, we're kind of an and not or company. We're not saying, all right, you know what, forget all that manual therapy we taught you, forget all the exercises we think are cool. What you need to do is just work on sleep. That's not our vibe. We work on both. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as the evening continues. But very interesting findings. All right. Maybe even bigger to understand is that it's not just pain. At this point, if I haven't convinced you that pain and sleep go together, then, I haven't done my job. It's very obvious if you look at any amount of research, it's very obvious that pain and sleep go together. What's less obvious is that a lot of other health behaviors, or health problems, I should say, are affected by sleep. So if you look at this graph, the percentage of people is on the y-axis, percentage of people dealing with the problem. On the x-axis are the dark color, the black is people that are sleeping poorly. The gray, the lighter color, is people that are sleeping well. And so you're looking at the percentages of people that sleep poorly that have X versus the percentage of people that sleep well that have X. And what you see is, pain is there. Obviously pain is very affected by lack of sleep, but look at these other things. So look at anxiety. That's the one that jumps off the page at me the most when you first look at it. Anxiety is huge. Activity limitation. We all know if you start limiting your activity, that your pain condition is more likely to continue, right? Depressive symptoms, mental distress, physical distress, poor health, frequent pain. Do these factors start to look familiar to you? Right? This is the cast of characters that we all know drive chronic pain experiences. We all know that, right? There's nothing there. All of these things sitting here at the bottom are very obviously the factors that drive chronic pain. We know that if we could do something that affected all of those things, we would probably help our chronic pain patients tremendously. And even those patients that aren't persistent pain patients, anybody, right? Like, I mean, there are a lot of folks that don't have persistent pain that do have a lot of depressive issues. They do have a lot of anxiety. I mean, these issues are skyrocketing with social media, with all sorts of things, with coronavirus, that all of these things drive these in our communities. We see a lot more of these issues, and we know these are the drivers for persistent pain. So what's interesting to me is that if we said, hey, there's a pill that you can do that will address all of these things at once, and guess what? There's no side effects. The only side effect is that you're going to have mental clarity. You're going to be able to tolerate more stress as a human being. Then that would be the most prescribed pill in the world, right? And we talk about that a lot with exercise, and I definitely believe it to be true with exercise, but I think we think less about pulling the lever of sleep. And this whole conversation should be about helping you understand that sleep is a huge lever we can pull for our patients. So when we think about lifestyle counseling, it cannot be done without addressing sleep. And you're looking at the reasons why. But does it work, right? That's the big question, is if you do address sleep hygiene, sleep behaviors with your patients, will it really help? This was a huge finding, right? This is tier 1 evidence, really, really good clinical review, a meta-analysis of RCTs. The effect of sleep interventions on depressive symptoms. And guess what? Sleep interventions have a large effect on depressive symptoms. Sleep interventions have a large effect on all of these bars, right? And if we can get those bars to calm down, we are now creating a human being that's not just getting by, right? Like, that's what most of our country, most of our world is doing. They're just getting by. They're just barely scraping by. They're living at the edge, right? They're buzzing the tower, but they're not thriving. They're not charging through life, changing everybody around them, being a positive influence, both, health and psychologically on their community. Most people are buzzing the tower, right? And we know if we can pull this lever of improving people's sleep, all of these things are going to get better. So huge, huge study, really cool one. Really good to see that we can address that. All right, before we start digging into a little bit more of how to address this, does anybody have any questions? It's a quiet bunch tonight. Cool. All right, the PSQI. So a lot of you might be thinking, that's great. I buy into this. I believe what you're saying, Zach. I want to start doing this. Well, if you buy into it, we've got to start measuring it, right? What gets measured gets changed. What doesn't get measured never gets changed. So the PSQI is a great place to start. It's very short. You can print this off. You can give it to folks that once you've had the conversation, and you understand that they're having a hard time sleeping, this is a great thing to pull out. So, it is basically the equivalent of the ODI in low back pain. The PSQI is really probably the most popular outcome measure in sleep. I don't give this to everybody. What I do is, in my subjective exam, I ask them, the most predictive question is, if you ask your patient, within 30 minutes of waking without a cup of coffee, do you feel refreshed? If their answer to that is no, like I'm over at the coffee pot, that is the most predictive question that they're having poor sleep. And if they say no to that, then they get the PSQI. If they say no, I'm good. I talk to them a little bit about how many hours they're getting, their quality, how they feel throughout the day, stuff like that. And if they're doing good, then we may not get into any of this. It's not something you have to do to everybody, but it's certainly, if you're starting to, those flags are going up and you're starting to think they're not sleeping well, give them the PSQI. It's a good starting place. All right. So I haven't asked you guys to read all these articles because they're a little bit lengthy, but I do want you to read this one. It's going to be in your weekly resources. It's probably already on the site if I know Alan well. A lot of people sleep on clinical perspectives. Like people get all hot and bothered about RCTs, and they are good. Like obviously a high level of evidence, but I don't know about you guys. Every time I read a clinical perspective, I leave with a little bit of clinically applicable material. And that is the most important thing to me. I don't have all the time in the world to read research anymore. So when I read it, what I want is to learn something that I can then turn around and use immediately on my folks. And clinical perspectives tend to hit that on the head, especially if you find a few authors that you really like that have written some. You'll find that you start to really like clinical perspectives. This one is Katie Siangsakon, so the lady that we talked about at the very beginning. This is a very good read. It's really practical advice. It will help you tomorrow in the clinic. Don't sleep on clinical perspectives. I think because it's an opinion piece, a lot of times people say, oh, it's a low level of evidence. It can be really helpful. You're learning from an expert, right? You're learning from an expert on that material, some things that they think are clinically applicable. I think they're great. Let's dig into it a little bit. So the number one thing I would say, this next part is sort of from the trenches. Katie has like 25 things to address sleep hygiene in that article. I didn't want to go through all of those because it's just very time consuming and sort of exhausting, but they are really good. So that's why I said, go read it. This is more from the trenches. This is what I do and what I suggest that you start doing. So the first things first, don't ask people to sleep more. Never ask people to sleep more. Can you imagine why? Nobody has time, right? If you say, hey, I need you to sleep a little bit more, everyone is going to say, hey, man, I don't have time. Sorry, I just don't have time. I'm too busy. Too busy. What you need to ask people is to sleep better. So don't sleep more, sleep better. Have that in your mind. So we've got a few things up here, but let's talk about them. Let's talk about the lowest hanging fruit, the ones I think are the easiest to get for your patients so that they can start trying to chip away and improve their sleep. So the number one driver would be sleep consistency, right? Going to bed and waking up at the same time. So Apple's got a pretty cool thing where it will do a bedtime alarm saying go to bed at this time and wake up at this time. And you can set that for any amount of hours of sleep that you need. But lots of things. Matthew Walker, the sleep expert I was telling you guys about, he suggests having a bedtime alarm and having a waking alarm so that you're always going to bed and waking up at the same time. When you do this, deep sleep is significantly enhanced. There's no doubt about it. It's significantly enhanced. This is the number one driver of sleep quality, consistency. So that's a good starting place, right? The next one is super easy for people to do, right? Cold. You want the room you're sleeping in cold. How cold? Katie says 64. Matthew Walker says 60 to 65. So sort of in that range. That's pretty chilly for some folks. Alexis and I love it to be cold. So we put ours at like 62. That's pretty cold for some people, but we like it to be cold. The colder the room, it seems to be the deeper the sleep. So get that room nice and cold. That's super easy. The only time that's not easy is like if you live in Tennessee in the summer, it gets hot and you got to really run your air to get it down. So people complain about it being expensive, but that's really a low hanging fruit to improve the depth of your sleep, right? The next thing is dark. The darker the room you're sleeping in, the more you'll be able to get deep sleep. So this can be, people might push back about this, but there's no reason people can't go out and buy some blackout shades. If they got a few windows in their room, get some blackout shades. Knocks out a lot of the light. The other thing are those sleep masks that cover your eyes. Those can be great, especially if they're traveling or something like that. Sleep masks can be great. There's some good evidence, but darkness seems to really help improve the depth of your sleep. The next thing is light, right? So first thing in the morning, they need to get exposure to light. If you live in certain places, Colorado, California come to mind, where it's just bright and sunny all the time, really the best way would be to get outside. Spend 15, 20 minutes outside first thing in the morning, have your coffee out there. That's great. Let that sun hit you. That really improves your circadian reflex when you do that. Now, I don't know, most of you guys probably aren't from Tennessee. It's rained like 6 out of 7 days this winter. So, I mean, we haven't had any sunlight. So what you want to do in that situation is just make sure you get the lights on. You can buy those little like sun lamps or Philips Hue light bulbs that kind of mimic UV rays. Those things work. I think the best thing to do is get outside. But, if there is no light outside, that's a little bit tricky. So if you're in a spot like here this winter or the Pacific Northwest or something, that can be tricky, but buy a sun lamp or something like that. I should probably say these are things that are really more important for the folks that aren't sleeping well. So, I mean, you may have that occasional patient that's like, hey, I want to sleep better. Tell me some things I can do to sleep better. These are good advice. But if somebody's having a hard time sleeping, if their PSQI is awful, they've answered, some things that made these are the low-hanging fruits for those folks. If they're not having a hard time, they don't necessarily have to jump through all these hoops. The next one is kind of interesting. Don't exercise at night, right? So if you exercise during the day, it is a huge improvement, or it has the ability to hugely improve your sleep, and you should do it, right? But the problem is it's an incredible stimulant. So I'm sure you guys remember the reticular formation from neuro, right? It just stimulates that cortex. And when you get up and move, your cortex lights up and it's firing on all cylinders. It's a stimulant, right? So within 4 hours of bed, you want to avoid that. You don't want stimulants within 4 hours of bed. So you want to avoid sleeping or exercising, in the last 4 hours of your waking time. Move that forward, right? The next thing is really interesting. Don't nap. So napping is a huge performance increaser in folks that get 7 hours or better of monophasic sleep. In those that don't, it reduces their sleep pressure at night. So if they're getting a full night of sleep, you're probably not having this conversation as much. But if they are, naps can be hugely important. I mean, you're seeing like Google and places like this, they allow naps at work. It's kind of interesting. And it's because they know the productivity will increase. But if you are not getting your full chunk of monophasic sleep at night, napping it's not going to improve it. So get the 7 hours first. That's really where we should be shooting for. The next thing is caffeine, right? So we know, you guys know this, the half-life of caffeine? The half-life of caffeine is 7 hours. So that means half of the caffeine is going to be inhibiting adenosine in your brain and reducing your sleep pressure for the next 7 hours after coffee. So, the rule I always tell people is afternoon, just cut it out, right? I mean, but, definitely when you're getting into that early afternoon stage, cut the caffeine out. Sometimes this catches people with pre-workout. So you'll catch a lot of folks that are wanting to recover better, and they're hammering this awful pre-workout stuff that's got like, tons and tons of milligrams of caffeine, 300, 400 milligrams of caffeine. They're doing that like 4 or 5 before they sleep. Well, half of that's still in their brain at bedtime. So there are plenty of pre-workouts that don't have caffeine. Beta-alanine seems to be the one that makes guys really excited because all their skin's burning and whatnot. So you might suggest that if somebody's having a hard time sleeping, or you might just dodge that altogether, but just let them know that caffeine's going to really inhibit your recovery. And that's a bigger deal than that boost you get from your pre-workout, no doubt about it. I say this next one is hard for me, but it's no alcohol, right? Or spicy foods 3 hours before bed. So what that tells me is you just need to start drinking in the morning and then you'll be safe. Totally kidding. What that tells me is that alcohol in the evening, it really does inhibit your sleep. And the interesting thing is a lot of times people don't recognize this until they're aware that that's a phenomenon, because you might knock out a bit faster because alcohol is a sedative, right? It's considered a sedative, but sedation and sleep are not the same thing. So you might knock out a bit quicker, but what you'll see is folks that drink alcohol before bed, they're going to have more waking periods at night. So they're going to have a lot of, they sleep for a little bit, wake, sleep for a little bit, wake, sleep for a little bit, wake. And what you'll see is that they'll forget that because they hammered a bunch of alcohol before bed. So if alcohol sort of makes it harder for them to remember the next morning that they had all those times that they woke up, whether that be to go to the bathroom or whether it just be because of the alcohol's effects on your brain. Either case, it inhibits your ability to sleep super well. Spicy food, same thing, and really any food. The more you read about intermittent fasting, the more you realize like a lot of our organs have circadian rhythms as well. So generally speaking, I think for most folks, you want to try to avoid big meals, before bed if they're having a hard time sleeping. The last thing is simple: reserve the bedroom for sleep and sex. So don't watch TV in there. You know, don't have long conversations in there. Like it's just in there for sleep and sex. So the better your brain gets at associating you walking into that room with time to knock out and go to sleep, the deeper your sleep will get. And that's another fact. So that's all of these things that we just covered to me are very simple. It's not like we've asked anyone to take any more time to sleep. That's not simple, right? A lot of people are busy out there in this world. So I think if you're asking people to sleep more, you're going to have a hard time getting them to do that. But if you ask them to sleep better and address some of these factors, they might actually do it. And when they actually do it, you might see a lot of these processing things that we've talked about improve, in which case you're going to create a more robust human being. And that's really what we're trying to do here. So these are low-hanging fruit. Let's cover a few additional resources, and then we'll wrap things up for the night. So probably the best resource and most exhaustive is on the far left of the screen. So Matthew Walker, I've mentioned him several times. World's most robust researcher in the sleep sciences. Like, I mean, he's just really, really in depth. I mean, he wanted to answer this question. His whole dissertation was like, why do we sleep? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense from a biological standpoint for people to just lay still for 8 or 9 hours a night. Why did we develop that? And so read that book. I mean, it is a long read, but it's really good. Why We Sleep. You can pick it up on Amazon or you can pick it up at any bookstore. It is a New York Times bestseller. Really, really good. If you want to hear Matthew Walker talk a little bit before you commit to that book, I mentioned the Joe Rogan podcast. So just put in, that it's episode 1109. That one is really, really good. If you're a little bit averse to like F-bombs and things like that, then you can always do Rhonda Patrick's. She's much more scientific. This one's a lot heavier, harder to listen to. It's a lot less like, with the cool thing about listening to Joe's is he's sort of a normal dude comedian. So you're hearing what a normal person would ask a sleep expert about these things versus Rhonda Patrick's another neuroscientist. So that one's a little bit more deep in the weeds. Both are really good. Both good podcasts. I stuck another YouTube video up there. So I've sent that to patients before, how to improve your sleep. So it for the folks pushing back on some of the alcohol type things, it's a good listen because it's it's short. It's like an 8-minute video and he addresses a lot of those things. So I would suggest watching that yourself. And then he's got a few other YouTube videos out there that are good, but I mean, just sort of having that on the ready for folks to how to improve their sleep, I think is a good idea. Some other products that are out there that are good. I mean, there's a bunch of meditation apps now. I think Calm and Headspace sort of lead the charge. So like both of those are really good. A lot of times people that have trouble sleeping, as we've already talked about, they already have some other stresses and anxiety. So we know if we can get them out of that sympathetic overdrive, we're probably doing them a huge service. And both of those things help tremendously with that. Both of these apps have like specific meditations that are built for sleeping. So there's a very soothing voice talking to them about trying to get to sleep. So really good products out there for both of those. Both are a subscription fee. I'm not exactly sure what they cost, but they're not bad. And I think both of them have free trials, so you can definitely check those out. Some other things you might consider if folks have resources to buy it, like things like the Philips Hue lights are cool. From what I understand, we don't have them. But you can control the color of the light. So at night you can start turning it more red or, more orange. And during the day or in the morning, you can turn it more like blue or bright or whatever, so that hopefully that's deepening that circadian reflex that we were talking about. Or these sun lamps, like this one is Casper. The mattress company makes that. I think the sleep masks have gotten better. They're comfortable now. This one is called a Manta sleep mask. And, I think it's pretty comfortable. It's, $20, $30. It's worth it, especially for folks that travel for work, because you don't know what you're going to get when you get in a hotel room or an Airbnb. It may be really bright. This just negates that. And you can certainly wear it every night at home as well. So all of those are really good products. A few other things are sort of the blue light. Blue light is really what sort of stimulates that um, nucleus in your hypothalamus to really start to work on your circadian rhythm. So the suggestion is to avoid screens at least 30 minutes before bed. I think the best suggestion is to avoid screens, but there's some folks that aren't going to do that, right? They're still going to be on their screens. And if they are going to be on their screens, things like blue light glasses or iPhones now come with night shift. And I would imagine Samsung has something similar. There's another app called Flux, does a very similar thing. And there's even one, like this little box, this Drift TV box is like something that you plug into your TV that basically has the same effect on your TV. So, for folks that have a little bit more resources, some of those things are worth suggesting if they're having a hard time sleeping, because it certainly helps to reduce that blue light exposure in the evening. And that's something you can consider. But I think it's good to have a healthy dose of these things available to tell people about so that they know you're serious about it and you're going to try to help them sort of address some of these sleep hygiene issues. Guys, that's all I've got for you tonight. Let's spend the next 10 or 15 minutes just taking some questions. Dan, I'm glad you caught that pun. I'm just now catching the chat bar there. That pun was intended. Any questions, any success stories, anything like that you guys want to share as far as addressing sleep with your patients, or maybe challenges you've run into that you want to troubleshoot? So Morgan asked, what is your thought on people who cannot stay asleep? Um, Certainly tricky. And my thought tends to always go back to trying to address these things that we talked about. And a lot of times it can be as simple as addressing one. So if they're doing all of these things, if they're practicing really good sleep hygiene and still not sleeping well, I, that's kind of the point at which I wonder about things like getting a sleep study or referring out to someone that's a bit more advanced on some of this stuff. I am not a big medication person, but I do know that, there are probably some folks that benefit from things like Ambien. I tend to avoid those things because my mom never let us go to the doctor as a kid. So we just kind of grown up thinking medicine was all bad. But, I think there are some conditions where even when you try the sleep hygiene stuff, it's tricky. But my tendency is, like, with those folks who can't stay asleep, is to really start chipping away at sleep hygiene and sleep behaviors and see if that doesn't help. The other thing I think most people don't wear themselves out enough. So I think most people are not challenging their body enough during the day and exercising. So that's not on this list, but it's really, really important to exercise during the day, because I think, evolutionarily speaking, we've spent a lot of time developing by like working, and now everything is easy. It's so easy to go get food. It's so easy to, get to and from work, all that type of stuff. So I think wearing yourself out a bit during the day is not a bad thing. Cara makes a good point about if you're listening to Why We Sleep on your commute, if you listen to the Audible version, it might make you sleepy. Very true. It is a tough read, but it's good. Alex, I know that older adult population is definitely it's interesting because a lot of them have falls, right, when they get up to go to the bathroom at night. And so sometimes even just addressing like their hydration schedule can be really important for them, because there are so many falls that happen at night going to the bathroom. So if you can keep them from having to get up, then you're reducing fall risk without even having to specifically address it. So it's huge, huge across any population. It's amazing how big of a lever sleep can be. Any other thoughts, questions, anything before we wrap up tonight? Biggest success story addressing sleep? Um, it's got to be in some of my persistent pain patients. I think of one specifically, a lady I worked with while I was doing residency in Texas, and she had a lot of mechanical pain, but it was in multiple areas of her body. So she had low back pain, bilateral hip pain, knee pain, and all were very mechanically reproducible and responded well to things like manual therapy and exercise. So it was kind of one of those things where it was like, at the time, I was very confused because I was like, she seems like a persistent pain patient, that's very, has a lot of nervous system ramp up, but everything is behaving very mechanically. So I was very confused at the time because I hadn't dealt with that a whole lot. And what I found working with my mentor was, you know, all of these things exist on a spectrum. So it's not like you can only have mechanical pain and only have persistent, or nervous system ramp up, all these things. So what I found was this lady was just dealing with a lot of stresses and anxieties in life. And so we started digging into her lifestyle a bit, and she wasn't sleeping well. And she wasn't doing a lot of things well. She was stressed because she was turning 40. And she felt a lot of like social pressure because she hadn't had kids yet and she wasn't married and some things like that. So we just kind of dug into some of that, which you can imagine for me is like a brand new PT in residency might. I mean, it was a bit like scary in a way for me to be digging into these areas of somebody's life. But what I found was when we did talk about it, and I gave her some resources. She We used Photo. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Photo, it's just like a digital version of all of these handouts. But the first like 6 visits, she made almost no progress. And then we had that conversation, and I think we had like 4 or 5 more visits. And over that time, her disability just sunk completely. So she got back to doing everything she wanted to do. A lot of that was on her, not on me. A lot of it was on more than just sleep. We incorporated a lot of neuroscience education, a lot of just exercise, those types of things. But for sure, addressing sleep, those types of things, I think really, really helped her. And that was probably the most gratifying patient I remember from residency, was just because it was one of those moments where it slapped you in the face and it was like, duh. Like, I mean, there's obviously more going on than just like low back pain here, and it didn't occur to me over the first few visits, but then when I really slowed down and thought about it, it did. So I think sleep, not unlike anything else we do, is often going to be one thing that you incorporate in your holistic approach to treating patients. You got to be sharp on everything. You got to be able to do those manual therapy things that help people. You got to be able to talk to people about their pain. You got to be able to talk to people about their lifestyle, their exercise, and you got to be able to talk to them about their sleep. I mean, we really don't have room for a gap. All right. Download those podcasts, read that Katie Siangsikon article, hit some of it. And if you think of any questions going forward, either hit me up directly or in the iStudents page. Happy to answer questions there as well. You guys have a good evening, and let me know if you need anything going forward. Thanks, guys.